MacCarthy Mór Lordship was the largest Gaelic lordship in Munster. Indeed, it was probably the second largest lordship in Ireland, with only the O'Neills of Dungannon being larger. Pushed out of Cashel by Brian Boru and the Dal Cais, they then came under threat from the expansionist Norman newcomers. However, the Battle of Callan in 1261 stabilised the lordship of Desmond. Despite internal and external conflict, the MacCarthy Mór Lordship proved resilient for several centuries. It would only come to an end following the defeat of Hugh O'Neill's Confederacy in the 9 Years' War, which resulted in the expansion of English rule throughout Ireland, the end of the many semi-autonomous lordships, and marked the beginning of the destruction of Gaelic Ireland. Originating in Cashel with the Cashel, the MacCarthys were pushed out of their traditional lands by the O'Briens in the 1100s. They ended up in Desmond, Desmond or South Munster. Although its borders were flexible and waxed and waned over time, it covered most of South Kerry and a large part of West Cork. Although they lost land to the Normans in the 1st century following their invasion, the Battle of Callan in 1261 brought this wave of expansion to a shuddering halt. It also roughly marked out the general division of South Munster between Gaelic and Anglo-Norman lords. The aftermath of Callan also saw the emergence of other MacCarthy lordships, MacCarthy Ray and Muskerry for example, as these lords successfully carved out power for themselves. However, unlike in Ulster, Norman, and later called Old English lords, continued to exert great influence all over Munster. From Callan to the beginning of the 17th century, the MacCarthy Mór Lordship and the Earls of Desmond had a complicated relationship, with the latter trying to exert overlordship over the former. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes not. As I mentioned, the origins of the MacCarthys were in the Oireachta, specifically the Cashel. The Oireachta dominated Munster for most of the early medieval period. Like most Irish power blocks over time, they split into various other blocks, such as Cashel or Lochaline. The Cashel were probably the most successful. However, with the rise of the Dal Cais in the late 10th century, the dominance of the Oireachta was broken, and Brian Boru was crowned King of Cashel and Munster at Cashel in 977. However, the death of Brian Boru and many of his relatives at Clontarf allowed the Oireachta to regain much of their prominence. They and the Dal Cais would continue to be bitter rivals. This rivalry crystallised in the O'Briens, the descendants of Brian Boru, on the one hand, and the MacCarthys on the other, the most important sept that would emerge from the Oireachta. They took their name from Cartock, an Oireachta Cashel king killed by Dal Cais in 1045. The struggle between the MacCarthys and O'Briens would continue until the arrival of the Normans, and indeed continue afterwards. In 1101, Muirhetic Ubrian, great-grandson of Brian Boru, pulled a very fast one on the MacCarthys by donating Cashel, the traditional birthplace of their dynasty, to the church, more specifically to the Bishop of Limerick, removing it from the control of the MacCarthys, and indeed from the power dynamics of Gaelic Ireland. The Oireachta and the Dal Cais fought over the kingship of Munster for another century or so after the death of Brian Boru. However, there were also conflicts within the septs. Brian Boru's descendants fought among themselves, as did the Oireachta. Indeed, Callahan O'Callaghan captured the lordship of Oireachta Cashel for a while. The struggle between Dal Cais and Oireachta over the kingship of Munster appeared to have been settled with the so-called Treaty of Glenmire. This was imposed by Turlough O'Connor, future High King of Ireland, albeit with opposition, on Muirhetic O'Brien and Taigh MacCarthy. O'Connor made a treaty with MacCarthy, recognising him as King of Desmond or South Munster, while O'Brien was given Thomond, West Munster. In this way, O'Connor split the potential opposition to him in Munster, ending the unified kingdom of Munster and replacing it with two other kingdoms. The MacCarthys thus became kings of Desmond. They held this lordship until the destruction of the Gaelic system in the early 17th century. However, the area over which they would rule would fluctuate around the borders. On the one hand, Muskerry, Carbery and Duhallow would split away. On the other, the frontier between Desmond and the Earl of Desmond's lands would prove to be quite malleable. Killorglin, for example, would alternate between MacCarthy and Geraldine control, albeit remaining more under the latter. The MacCarthys would also come to control areas around Killarney such as Ahadoe and Fossa. The Norman invasion had a huge impact on Munster, as the MacCarthy-O'Brien struggle was cut across by the newcomers who came to control large parts of the province and most of the best land. Diarmid MacCarthy was one of the first Irish kings to swear fealty to Henry II, though this did not prevent Henry from granting the Kingdom of Munster in 1175 to Robert Fitzstephen and Miles Jacogan. This marked the beginning of a long struggle for the control of Desmond between the MacCarthys and various Anglo-Normans. It also showed that both the MacCarthys and O'Briens had lost the struggle for dominance in Munster, and were instead reduced to holding on to their own core territories. Thomond became reduced to Clare, and Desmond to South Kerry and part of Cork. The successful Normans would come to be dominated by the Shannon Geraldines, later to become the Earls of Desmond, as well as offshoots such as the Fitzmaurices and Knights of Kerry. The Geraldines were quite successful in much of Cork, Limerick and North Kerry. Within a century or so, the MacCarthys been pushed back into South Kerry, Orivera, Beara and parts of West Cork, which formed the kingdom and later lordship of Desmond. The Geraldines proved skilled at taking advantage of conflicts within the MacCarthys, often supporting a particular lord against others. Paul MacCotter, for example, shows that the Shannon Geraldines followed a policy of supporting, quote, the lordship of one segment of the royal house of MacCarthy against all others, in return for which this line of kings of Desmond acknowledged the lordship of the Shannon Geraldines and paid a substantial chief rent, as did the subservient native septs, as incidents of vassalage, end quote. In 1247, after the death of Cormac Fionn MacCarthy, the Geraldines supported the candidacy of his son Donal Rua, even killing a rival candidate, Donal God Kerbarach, Cormac Fionn's brother. Once again, this triggered considerable strife among the MacCarthys, as Donal God's son, Fineen, soon emerged on the scene. He would prove to be a very talented leader, causing considerable trouble to the Geraldines. However, it's worth noting that the Shannon Geraldines were not the only Normans interfering in Desmond. The Cogans also did so, but these supported different branches of the MacCarthys. Indeed, the Cogans actually supported the line of Donal God. Nonetheless, the relationship between the MacCarthys and the Fitzgeralds was never easy. Nor did the MacCarthys easily accept to be vassals. Depending on which side had the upper hand, the frontier between the areas of Norman settlement and Gaelic lands could waver considerably, especially in South Kerry. Here, a series of castles were built, such as Killorglin, Dunloe and Ahadoe, marking a rough frontier. Almost all were burned, captured and recaptured over time. This is most clearly seen in the Battle of Callan. This was part of an internal MacCarthy conflict between the line of Donal God MacCarthy and Donal Rua. Donal God's son Fineen would win the Battle of Callan, in which John Fitzthomas, 1st Baron Desmond, and his eldest son were killed. This left the Geraldines leaderless for a considerable period, until the remaining heir was old enough to assume power. Fineen was unable to take much advantage of this, as he was killed a year later, followed a short while later by his brother. This allowed Donal Rua to take over the lordship of Desmond. Eventually, Donal God's descendants would form their own lordship in Carbery, becoming known as MacCarthy Ray, forming a kind of march lordship between much more powerful neighbours. Callan defined in broad terms the general outline of Desmond. Though various areas would change hand, the lordship consisted of South Kerry, in other words Evera, and occasionally some areas north of the River Lawn, Beara and other parts of West Cork. The relationship between MacCarthy Mór and the Earls of Desmond would continue to be complicated. The Earls saw the MacCarthys as their vassals, and sometimes were able to enforce this and get the Gaelic lords to pay rent. However, various MacCarthy Mórs at times were close to the Earls of Desmond, though, like all political relationships, this fluctuated. For example, the Dermot MacCarthy who burned Dingle later became reconciled with Maurice FitzThomas, who would become the first Earl of Desmond in 1329. Indeed, after Dermot MacCarthy was killed in Tralee Court, FitzThomas avenged him, blinding William Fitznicholas, one of the Fitzmaurices, who was responsible for the killing, and having all others involved killed. Dermot MacDermot of MacCarthy, founder of the Duhallow line, known as MacDermot, was also, according to Nichols, a close ally of the Earl of Desmond. However, after the Earl's death, this led to him being attacked by Crown forces in 1353. Cormac MacCarthy, leader of the MacCarthy Mór Lordship at this time, took part in this campaign. He benefited from this by being given a charter from Edward III, granting him Macroom and other land in Muskerry and Duhallow. Generally, the MacCarthy Mór Lordship grew in strength during this period. This was despite the continual conflicts within the lordships between various MacCarthy septs, such as between Donal Rua and the descendants of Donal God, or in succession to Donal Rua. As mentioned, this resulted in the emergence of the sub-lordships of Carbery, Muskerry, and eventually Duhallow. There was also conflict with some other septs within Desmond, notably the O'Sullivans. In 1411, for instance, Tig MacCarthy was actually driven out of Desmond by a revolt of O'Sullivan. However, he returned shortly afterwards and appears to have obtained, as compensation for this, Valentia Island and other lands in Evora which O'Sullivan had been granted by the Earl of Desmond. Evidence of the strength of MacCarthy Mór can be seen in 1316 when Dermot MacCarthy attacked Corcradivna and burned Dingle town. He seems to have done this either in support of the Bruce invasion or to take advantage of it. Despite these conflicts, the MacCarthy Mór Lordship grew stronger. Central to this was that when the above-mentioned Cormac MacCarthy died, he was succeeded by his son. This was the first of 5 father-son successions in a row in the lordship, something unprecedented in Gaelic Ireland. Something else that probably played a role was the fact that the MacCarthy Mór Lordship was hemmed in by Norman or Old English lords. Unlike the O'Neills in Tyrone or the O'Donnells in Tyrconnell, there was nowhere for the lordship to expand, and thus little room for new rival lineages or lordships to emerge. After Carbery, Muskerry and Duhallow broke away, the MacCarthy Mór Lordship mostly stayed the same. At times the most powerful Iartha in Desmond, O'Sullivan of Dungannon, did revolt, but largely unsuccessfully. In what may seem to contradict this point, various MacCarthy septs did emerge within the MacCarthy Mór Lordship. These included Shlucht Cormac os Dunguil, Clan Donal Fionn, Shlucht Owen Vor of Cushmain, Mac Fionnin. All of these held lands in Evora and Maguni, the adjoining barony, and Shlucht Donal Vrick, Shlucht Ineen and Rearda. These last two were smaller and confined to Evora. Added to these were the domain lands of the MacCarthy Mór, Ballycarbery, part of Valentia and Valentia Harbour, and a large amount of land in the Maguni barony around Killarney, Loughlin and Ahadoe. However, this was something natural in the Gaelic political system. Septs were continually fracturing, with new ones emerging and others disappearing. Moreover, none of these minor septs seemed to threaten the MacCarthy Mór Lordship. From more or less the 14th century onwards, MacCarthy Mór Lordship and succession entered a long period of stability. During this time, Donal MacCarthy Mór founded Muckross Abbey, one of the jewels of the lordship. There were also other abbeys in Derrynane and Ballinaskelligs, but Muckross, the easiest to reach and nearest the heart of the lordship, was the richest. Interestingly, Donal's father was called Tig the Monasteach, Tig of the monastery, leading to a mistaken belief that he had founded the abbey. Then, in the 1480s, a rather complicated period began. in a way marking the end of the strongest period of the lordship. This started with Donald MacCarthy's son, Cormac Lea, supporting Eilish Barry, the widowed Countess of Desmond, against her brother-in-law. Then, there was great confusion over the bishopric of Ardfert, in order to exclude the bishop Philip Stack. It's not exactly known what the latter did, but he managed to unite all the nobility, Gaelic and Old English, of Kerry against him, except for O'Sullivan. In addition to this unprecedented unity of long-time enemies or rivals, such as the Earl of Desmond and Fitzmaurice, this also led to the strange situation whereby the vast majority of the nobility of Kerry were excommunicated. However, as the English had long discovered, the writ of the papacy did not mean much in Kerry at that time. Then, in 1489, there was a war between MacCarthy Mór and the Geraldines of Kerry. This resulted in the death of Taig MacCarthy's son Dermot, who killed the son of the Knight of Kerry before being killed by the Earl of Desmond. Taig MacCarthy died in 1503, being succeeded by his son Donald, who then died a few years later in 1508. His death was marked by bitter conflict between the brother and son of Donald, named Cormac Lawrock and Taig na Liauma, respectively. The lordship was divided between the two in 1513. It was reunified the following year when Taig na Liauma died. Cormac Lawrock then succeeded, but died in 1516, ushering in a dark period due to the lack of sources, whether Gaelic or English. Indeed, in his work on the lordship, Nichols points out that we do not know who succeeded Cormac Lawrock. There's a gap of about 40 years before we know the next MacCarthy Mór. Donald of Drummondine. Nichols said it's possible he was from the Dungannon MacCarthys. Donald of Drummondine died in 1558 and was replaced by his son, also called Donald. The MacCarthy Mórs loved this name. This Donald MacCarthy would be the last, or the second last, depending on how you view it, MacCarthy Mór. Florence MacCarthy's attempts to play both sides cost him and Hugh O'Neill dear. As a result, Florence would spend the rest of his life in the Tower of London. Despite supporting the Spaniards at Cashel, the illegitimate Donald survived the war. He was granted some lands, but only a fraction of what the MacCarthy Lordship had been. Defeat at Cashel ensured that all Gaelic lordships would come to an end as the English came to control all of Ireland for the first time. The political structures of Gaelic Ireland were rapidly dismantled, and a new colonial state was built instead. In the future, I'll return to parts of this long story in detail, especially the MacCarthy Mór Lordship under Elizabeth. For now, I hope you've enjoyed this history of the MacCarthy Mór Lordship. Thanks for watching and for supporting the channel. Please subscribe, and if you can support the channel, please do so. My Buy Me a Coffee account is mentioned in the notes. Until next time, Gurav Mahagav Galer.